Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into some pretty provocative source material. Its title is 5 Lies Sunni Mosques Keep Telling You, and, well, it sets out to challenge 5 really foundational beliefs in early Islamic history. Okay, so let's jump right in. The sources we're looking at start with a really big question, something fundamental to think about. How is history actually decided? And maybe more importantly, who gets to write the story that everyone remembers?
All right, first up, the sources take aim at a huge one. The idea that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ left the whole question of his succession wide open for the community to figure out on their own.
So the widely held belief is that the Prophet ﷺ didn't name anyone. But these sources, they say no way. They argue he explicitly appointed Imam Ali alayhi salam at a place called Ghadir Khumm. This isn't just a minor disagreement. It's a direct challenge to the legitimacy of that whole meeting at Saqifah, where the first caliph was chosen.
And to back this up, they point to this specific verse from the Quran. The argument here is that this wasn't just a general revelation. They say it was a direct, divine command to the Prophet ﷺ, telling him, you have to announce this now, even though he might have been worried about how some people would take the news.
And this is a really interesting part of their argument. They say this declaration at Ghadir Khumm wasn't some radical, out-of-the-blue event. It actually fit perfectly with two traditions. The divine one, where prophets often appoint successors from their own family, and the Arab cultural one, where succession through family was, pretty standard.
Okay, let's move on to the second point. This one tackles the very common belief that all the companions who took part in something called the Pledge of Ridwan were automatically guaranteed a spot in paradise.
Now, the sources actually start with the exact verse people use to make that argument, but they ask us to zoom in and look really closely at one critical word.
And that word is believers. You see, the argument is that God's pleasure was with the believers among them, right at that moment. It wasn't some unconditional lifetime pass to paradise. It was entirely conditional on them sticking to their faith and, well, their actions. So to build their case, the texts start listing things that happened later. They point out that the pledge was specifically about not running away from a battle. But then they say many of those same people fled at the Battle of Hunayn. And it gets more specific. They claim the man who killed the famous companion Ammar ibn Yasir was there at the pledge. For these sources, these later actions completely voided that initial promise. And this is where it gets really interesting. They bring in a well-known prophetic hadith to connect the dots.
So the hadith says Ammar's killer is in the fire. And these sources identify that killer as a companion named Abu al-Ghadiyah, who was, you guessed it, present at Ridwan and made that pledge. This, in their view, creates a massive contradiction. How can someone be guaranteed paradise and be guaranteed the fire by the Prophet ﷺ himself?
All right, let's look at the third challenge. This one is all about Abu Bakr and that famous title he's known by, As-Siddiq, which means the Truthful. The whole argument here revolves around a dispute over a piece of land called Fadak. This land was claimed by the Prophet's own daughter, Fatima Zahra, Salamu alayha, as her inheritance right after her father, Salamu alayhi, passed away. What happened was, Abu Bakr denied her claim. He cited a hadith that he said he heard, that prophets do not leave inheritance. The sources then point out that this led to Fatima Zahra, Salamu alayha, becoming so angry with him that she never spoke to him again for the rest of her life. So by taking her property based on a narration that she and her husband, Imam Ali alayhi salam, didn't accept, the sources argue he committed a major injustice, which really puts that title, the Truthful, into question.
Okay, moving on to number 4. This one takes a hard look at the common image of Umar ibn al-Khattab as this absolute pillar of bravery.
To challenge this image, the texts zoom in on a specific moment in history, the Battle of Khaybar, which was this really tough campaign against some powerful fortresses.
So the sources lay out this sequence of events. On day 1, the Prophet ﷺ sends Abu Bakr with the banner and he comes back defeated. Then on day 2, he sends Umar. And according to these accounts, he also returns defeated. But it's worse. His own men are accusing him of being a coward and he's turning around and accusing them right back.
Now listen to what the Prophet ﷺ says after these two failures. This is really the heart of the argument. He says, "Tomorrow I'm going to give the banner to a man who loves Allah and His Messenger and is loved by them in return. He is a repeated attacker, not a fleer.
That last part, not a fleer, is what the sources really latch onto.
And the contrast they present couldn't be more stark. On one side, you have the fleer, with these sources citing narrations of Umar running from the battle. And on the other, the attacker. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa alihi then gives the banner to Imam Ali alayhi salam, who goes on to defeat their champion and conquer the fortress. This direct comparison is the whole basis for their reevaluation of Umar's courage.
Okay, our fifth and final section kind of ties all of this together. It challenges the whole narrative around the first two caliphs and what their rule was actually like.
The sources make some pretty bold claims here. They call the gathering at Saqifah a coup, not a consensus. They argue that a sort of cultural program was started to de-sanctify the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wa alihi, to suggest that maybe he wasn't infallible in worldly matters. And crucially, they state that Omar actually forbade people from writing down the hadith, the sayings of the Prophet. And why would he do that? The sources claim it was so their own personal judgment, their own ijtihad, could essentially overrule what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa alihi had already established.
So after going through all 5 of these points, what's the big takeaway from these sources?
Let's just recap really quickly. We've walked through 5 major points where this source material offers a completely different take on early Islamic history. Succession, they say, was divinely appointed. Paradise was a conditional promise, not a blank check. Abu Bakr's title of the Truthful is challenged. Umar's bravery is seriously questioned. And the very foundation of the Caliphate is framed as a major departure from the Prophet's plan.
And this really just leaves us with one final big question to think about. If history is truly written by the victors, what other stories, what other perspectives have been lost simply because one narrative became the only one we're ever told?